One has to admire the ambition of making a sequel to perhaps the most influential science fiction movie of all time. And no, I'm not talking about Star Wars. I'm talking about Stanley Kubrick's 1968 classic, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Dumb. That's what it is.
It was the movie that forever changed what anyone thought science fiction film was capable of. Up to that time, it was mostly seen as kind of a kiddie genre or disposable, but 2001: A Space Odyssey was a cerebral masterpiece. So, how does one make a sequel to a film like that when, of course, Stanley Kubrick had no interest in ever doing a sequel? You'd go to the only obvious choice, director Peter Hyams.
This is crazy.
You bet it is.
Who had directed Outland and Capricorn One. Okay, well, perhaps not such an obvious choice after all, but I gotta say, a pretty inspired one because 2010, the year we make contact, is a really underrated movie, and it's this month's best movie you never saw.
3, 2, 1. Выпусти разделительные болты.
Good morning, Dr. Chandra. This is Hal. I'm ready for my first lesson.
So this one picks up 9 years after 2001: A Space Odyssey. Dave Bowman, the astronaut who, of course, became the star child in 2001, has vanished, never to return. Keir Dullea played him in 2001 and would also play him in 2010. So in this movie, Discovery One's mission overseer, Heywood Floyd, who was the character in 2001 that was speaking to his daughter on a satellite phone, which everybody was amazed by, the fact that you could talk to somebody on a video screen, which of course we now do constantly.
We'll be able to talk to each other, see each other on television.
Heywood Floyd, played by Roy Scheider this time, is given the opportunity to take part in a joint USSR-US mission to see what went wrong. There's only one problem. The two countries are on the cusp of all-out nuclear war, and tension between the American and Soviet teams looks to unmoor an already impossible mission.
A Russian craft flown by Russians, carrying a few poor Americans who need our help.
So, this movie not only stars Roy Scheider, but also co-stars a young Helen Mirren, John Lithgow, Bob Balaban, and Keir Dullea, of course, returning from 2001. It has a really interesting score by David Shire, and it's written and directed by Peter Hyams. Crafting a sequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey definitely sounds like a fool's errand.
Dumb. That's what it is.
Being that it's one of the most acclaimed films ever made, in order to be judged any kind of success, the sequel would have to be some kind of masterpiece. In 1984, director Peter Hyams was coming off of the success of Capricorn One, which at the time was one of the most successful independent films ever made, and is definitely a little gem that's worth checking out. He had also done a couple of mid-level studio programmers, like The Star Chamber with Michael Douglas, which is a completely forgotten movie now, but is actually a lot of fun, and the underrated Outland, starring Sean Connery, in basically a sci-fi twist on High Noon. He decided he was going to give it a go, and it's actually not as crazy an idea as it sounds because author Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, had also written a well-received sequel to the book that the original 2001 was based on. And MGM, celebrating their Diamond Jubilee, gave Hyams a really healthy $28 million budget, which was comparable to, something like Return of the Jedi. With star Roy Scheider coming off of Blue Thunder, which was a huge hit in 1983, and co-star John Lithgow having recently earned back-to-back Oscar nominations for The World According to GARP and Terms of Endearment, it looked for a while like 2010 was going to be a solid hit, with Kubrick himself giving the film his reserved blessings. He even, in some kind of weird cameo, plays the Soviet premier. Not actually in person, but there's a photo of Time magazine where the premier's on the cover, and it's actually Stanley Kubrick. So Hyams said that he actually went to Stanley Kubrick, told him exactly what was going on, and wouldn't actually do the film unless he approved. And he didn't think that necessarily Stanley Kubrick was going to do it, but he said, sure, go ahead, I don't really care. He actually also told him not to be afraid and just to do your own movie, which I think was pretty solid advice because 2010 really does stand on its own. In fact, if you happen to think that 2001: A Space Odyssey isn't the masterpiece that everybody else seems to think it was, you still might like 2010. It really kind of does its own thing, and it's a cool little sci-fi movie of its own. Alas, 2010 was little more than a middling success at the box office. The reviews were respectful, if not overly enthusiastic, and contrary to popular opinion, the film was actually not a huge financial flop. It grossed a very decent, for 1984, $40 million, and it beat the pants off of Dune at the box office, and it also did very well on the then nascent home video market. Even still, over the years, the film has kind of vanished into obscurity, not helped by the fact that, of course, the Cold War ended shortly after the film came out, and it made the premise of the US being on the verge of war with the Russians prematurely dated. So, in a lot of ways, 2010 has always kind of been a curio for fans. Now, I'm not going to make a case for 2010 being a movie that comes close to Kubrick's film. It's not. And I actually think that making a sequel to it was kind of a bad idea in the first place, because you really can't make a sequel to a genre-defining classic like that. It's just always a bad idea. It'd be like doing a sequel to Casablanca or Citizen Kane.
Dumb. That's what it is.
But Peter Hyams really does deserve some credit for making a pretty damn decent sci-fi drama that likely would be held in much higher esteem were it not a sequel to what a lot of people think is the greatest movie ever made. It's an interesting counterpoint to the quintessential 80s blockbuster, which always painted the Soviet villains as bloodthirsty maniacs.
Most sons of bitches.
Here, the conflict between the two nations is presented as mere ideology, and that when you get down to it, the Soviet astronauts and their American counterparts aren't all that different, finding common ground pretty early on.
Hey, would I lie to you?
In that way, the film is actually a convincing plea for peace, although it's certainly a bit quaint to see a movie set in 2010 where the political problems haven't evolved beyond the 80s. It helps that Hyams put together one heck of a good team, drawing in a much better than average cast, including Roy Scheider, who was still in his post-Jaws sweet spot as the quintessential Hollywood everyman. He's maybe a little too blue-collar to be playing the intellectual Haywood, but he makes for a likable hero. Helen Mirren as the Soviet captain also makes for an intriguing counterpoint, as the respectful if lightly adversarial relationship is well conveyed all throughout the film. I also appreciate the distinct lack of romance between the two, which would have been very cliche. Ditto John Lithgow, who's terrific as the Discovery One's designer, and the great Bob Balaban as Hal's programmer, because yes, Hal is back in the movie.
I'm sorry for the delay. My voice recognition circuits are not completely restored, although as you can see, they are improving.
And in fact, probably the biggest get of the film was that not only would Keir Dullea be back to play Dave Bauman, but Douglas Rain was going to come back and revoice Hal once again. Now, one of the big changes in the sequel is that Hal is now kind of a good guy, with some dialogue explaining that Hal was reprogrammed by meddling White House spies, and that now he's been cleared of his bad wiring, he's a benevolent figure. In fact, he's almost presented as this kind of Christ-like figure in the end, as he kind of sacrifices himself to save everyone.
And if I don't proceed with the launch,
And the Leonov and everybody in it could be destroyed.
It's a nice twist, and it would have been easy for Hyams to use Hal as, a villain again and turn it into a generic thriller, and that's something he avoids. Hal really is the most heroic character in the movie in some ways. They also go light on the classical music, of course, which was one of the defining things of 2001, opting for an electronic score by David Shire, which, although dated, is pretty good. All in all, this movie is a lot more Apollo 13 than 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I really like that it does its own thing. Now, there are some really, really nice moments in this movie that depict the gradual warming of the relationships between the Russian and American crews, and there's two in particular that really kind of, are quite emotional for a movie like this. One is the part in the movie where a dangerous maneuver is happening, Roy Scheider's taking refuge, and a tearful cosmonaut comes in because she basically just wants somebody to hold her. I thought this was a really nice moment, and also devoid of any romance, despite the fact that the cosmonaut's actually pretty good looking. And there's also a great scene with John Lithgow's character as he's kind of panicking while doing a spacewalk and is saved by a Russian astronaut. Moments like these really kind of elevate the film, in my opinion. So, 2010 is actually pretty easy to see. It's out on Blu-ray and digital HD, and it looks a heck of a lot better than it ever did when I watched it on VHS over and over again in the 80s and 90s. Now, Peter Hyams is a very interesting director, and he's one of our favorites here at The Best Movie You Never Saw. I've talked about a lot of his movies in the past, including Running Scared, which was his follow-up to this with Gregory Hines and Billy Crystal, and I've always thought that he was an excellent journeyman director. And it's interesting to hear Quentin Tarantino and Roger Avary pay repeated tribute to him on the new Video Archives podcast as they reviewed a couple of his movies, including Busting and The Relic, which Tarantino seems to think is completely underrated. He's generally regarded as something of a journeyman due to the fact that he's opted to mostly shoot studio programmers, but I don't know. I mean, he wrote a lot of these movies, and he also always served as his DP. He's a really good director of photography as well, and he shot a lot of his son John Hyams' movies. And John Hyams, for the record, is also an excellent director. Some of Peter Hyams' movies are excellent, such as Running Scared or Outland. Some of them are pretty terrible, including perhaps the worst Ray Bradbury adaptation ever, A Sound of Thunder. But 2010 belongs with, I think, probably his best movie, Capricorn One, as an example of him as a top-shelf Hollywood director. Again, this isn't anywhere near the level of a Stanley Kubrick film, but it's much better than it had any right to be, and it's worth checking out for the curious fan who can separate it from the original.
Goodbye, Dr. Chandra.